Thank you, Caroline. We are recording. We're recording so we can share this with people who have signed up but aren't able to join us tonight. And we'll share it back with all of you as well in a follow-up email when this is all over. So thank you, Caroline. I appreciate that intro. Thank you for keeping it tight. And thank you to the panelists for tonight. And thank you to the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust and the Cathants River Education Alliance as well for sponsoring this really important series. Climate change obviously is a topic of global significance. And if there's just even a couple of words I'd want to sort of use to frame this evening's discussions and the future sessions that we're going to have in the weeks ahead, it's about urgency and agency. So we would like to convey to you the urgency of this issue and all its many aspects, but we would also like to see if we can identify opportunities for you to take action yourself, agency, and in whichever ways seem most appropriate to you. And I've asked our panelists tonight to think about that as they do their work. Before we actually get going, I would like to pause and just reflect for a moment to acknowledge that we are, at least myself and I believe most of the panelists, are all coming to you on land, unceded territory here in what we now call Maine, which has been the home of Wabanaki for generations out of mind. And in this particular topic, and speaking now more personally, there's an opportunity here, I think, for us to learn about our relationship to the earth from folks who've been living in this part of the world for more generations than I can count. So I would like to just acknowledge that this evening. As we get going, one of the things, just as a small icebreaker, and just to make sure also you know how to use your controls on Zoom, we had a poll question. And Caroline, should I just sort of say the poll question, or is there a screen that's going to be shared for that? I think it's, there we go. So there's a poll question that we're only doing one. It's an icebreaker. And I'll just read it to you if you're not seeing it on your screen, but it basically was, I guess, your sense of how much land was conserved in the current legal sense in 1980 and how much is conserved today. And I'll just let that go. For those who have been joining, there you go, it's up there. And for those who are just joining, oh, it says host and panelists cannot vote. Shucks. For those who are joining, even as we're getting the introduction going, I will also reiterate that as we get going, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce all the speakers in a moment. They will make their presentations and then we'll go to an open Q&A at the end. But just so you capture the question while it's fresh in your mind, please use that Q&A function to do it. We'll be monitoring that. We won't be monitoring the chat function. So don't use the chat for questions. I think when Bill comes up, we might do the big reveal about the answers to question 1 and 2 there, because that's his kind of bailiwick. And I suspect he knows what those answers are himself. So we're really blessed this evening to have 4 wonderful panelists. Sarah Curran is currently the Deputy Director of Climate Planning and Community Partnership, and she's in Governor Mills' Office of Policy Innovation and the Future, which is a wonderful new agency, but brings the functions of planning and innovation and thinking about the future back to state government in a way that really has not been the case for many, many years. So I'm really glad Sarah's with us tonight. She's going to give us an overview of the Maine Won't Wait efforts of the Climate Council and creating a plan, a master plan for Maine's actions there. And we're then going to dip into several elements of it, but not all of it. So Sarah's sort of giving us the big context. She'll be followed by Bill Patterson, who's a Deputy Director of the Bureau of Parks and Lands. Thank you, Bill, for stepping in tonight. At the sort of late notice, Andy Cutco, his boss, I guess, was unable to be with us, but Bill has many, many years in land conservation with the Nature Conservancy, as well as his relatively new role here at the Bureau of Parks and Lands. We'll then hear from Ben Lake, who's an expert on transportation and the energy sector and transportation and trying to deal with climate work in that. Ben, I actually don't know where you are living, but I know that the organization that you work for is based principally out of Vermont and has offices around the country. And last but absolutely not least, Maulian Dana. I'm very glad to have you joining us, Maulian. She joins us from Indian Island. She is the ambassador from the Penobscot Nation to localities, state government, as well as the federal government. And ambassador is kind of one of those terms that encompasses as many things as she can pack into it. So she, in this particular instance, served on the equity subcommittee of the Climate Change Climate Council, and is going to be talking to us about elements of social justice, climate justice, and equity, which is a little bit of a different take from the first two. So I think with that, Sarah, I'd like to just turn it over to you and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. Tim, can you just tell me if you can see that presentation?
I can see the screen.
Great, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Curran, and I'm with the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. I'm really excited to see how many people have joined us tonight. And my role this evening is to briefly provide a big picture overview of climate action in Maine, and specifically of Maine Won't Wait, the state's climate action plan. So on December 1st, 2020, the Maine Climate Council delivered Maine Won't Wait, which is the state's 4-year action plan, to the governor and the legislature. Maine has several important climate goals that I want to highlight. The first are our emission reduction targets, which are established in state law. So 45% below 1990 levels by 2030, 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And the governor has also established a goal to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. The state also has a goal to ensure that our people, industries, and communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change, which we are already experiencing across the state. In terms of emissions, 3/4 of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation and buildings. So I'm glad that Ben is going to spend some time tonight discussing the transportation working group. Transportation accounts for more than half of Maine's emissions, so strategies to reduce emissions in that sector are critically important. The council that delivered the Climate Action Plan includes 6 working groups and a scientific and technical subcommittee, and more than 230 Maine people with diverse experiences and backgrounds helped to develop the Climate Action Plan. A new equity subcommittee was created to support planning and implementation of climate strategies to ensure benefits across diverse populations of Maine people. Like other dislocations and disruptions, climate change will most impact those who are already vulnerable. And Ambassador Dana, who co-chairs the equity subcommittee, will be presenting on their work this evening. Maine Won't Wait includes 8 strategies to achieve our climate goals, and I'm just going to go through these briefly. They are to embrace the future of transportation in Maine with electric vehicles and by reducing vehicles miles traveled with increased access to broadband, public transit, and opportunities to bike and walk. To modernize Maine's buildings by weatherizing homes and businesses and transitioning to cleaner heating and cooling systems like heat pumps and energy efficient appliances. To reduce carbon emissions in the energy and industrial sectors through clean energy innovation, and to achieve by 2030 an electricity grid where 80% of Maine's usage comes from renewable generation and 100% by 2050. To grow Maine's clean energy economy and good jobs, because transitioning to cleaner energy generation and greater energy efficiency offers economic opportunity for Maine, and supporting the ability of Maine's natural resource industries to adapt to climate change impacts and take advantage of new market opportunities. To protect Maine's environment and working lands and waters and increase carbon sequestration, including the protection of working farmland and forest land to keep it working. And Bill's going to talk more about the role of conservation in addressing climate change. So I'll just mention that Maine is 90% forested, among the most forested states in the nation. And there are enormous opportunities for ongoing and increased carbon sequestration, including forests as well as ocean opportunities called blue carbon that can help us meet our carbon neutrality goal. To build healthy and resilient communities by providing state support for communities to be proactive about understanding, planning, and acting to reduce their risks from climate change, to invest in climate-ready infrastructure, including assessing vulnerability and improving design standards, and finally, to engage Maine people and communities in climate impacts and opportunities through effective communication about Maine's climate strategies. December 1st was the 1-year anniversary of the Climate Action Plan, and we released a progress report, which is available on our website. It includes this dashboard, which highlights the progress we've made on key indicators such as installing heat pumps, expanding public infrastructure or public charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and increasing the percentage of Maine's energy that comes from renewable resources. The progress report also highlights the historic nature of funding that has become available to support Maine's climate efforts, including from the American Rescue Plan and the Federal Infrastructure Bill, as well as the state's biennial budget. In addition, Governor Mills and the Maine legislature enacted nearly 24 pieces of legislation last year that are aligned with Maine Won't Wait, including bans on harmful hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, and the adoption of sea level rise projections, appliance efficiency standards, and among the first targets for clean energy battery storage in the US. I'm going to go quickly over the next several slides, but I wanted to highlight that this historic funding includes funds for key climate strategies, including charging for electric vehicles, public transportation, and broadband. It includes funding for energy efficiency and weatherization programs and energy efficient for affordable housing. And these slides will be available afterwards if you can't quite make it through all of the bullets as I'm going through. It includes funding for clean energy innovation, workforce development, and infrastructure. And funding for community resilience and resilient infrastructure, including $40 million for the Land for Maine's Future program and $4.75 million for climate action grants to communities through a new program that I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on this evening. The program is the Community Resilience Partnership, and it was launched on December 1st to provide grants and assistance to communities in Maine to reduce carbon emissions, transition to clean energy, and become more resilient to climate impacts, such as extreme weather, flooding, rising sea levels, public health impacts, and more. As these maps demonstrate, the climate plan identifies that many Maine communities lack the planning capacity and resources to prepare for climate impacts, and many communities have high levels of social vulnerability that make them more vulnerable to climate impacts, such as percentages of low income and older residents. The partnership has 3 types of funding opportunities: grants to communities for planning and implementation of climate and energy priorities, grants to service provider organizations to help communities get started, and contracts with regional coordinators to support communities in implementation and securing funding for their priority projects. And you can learn more about the new program at the Community Partnership website right there. Finally, I also want to mention a new website for climate action that our office launched on December 1st as well. And here you can find stories and ideas that Maine people, businesses, and communities can use to help them take action on climate change. One of the most exciting things about the past year has been seeing how the Maine Won't Wait plan has become a blueprint for community action for communities and organizations around the state. And we hope that the new website, as well as the new partnership program, will further support those who recognize the need for urgent action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and transition to clean energy and prepare for climate impacts. So thank you very much for inviting me to join you this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to that place in the agenda. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Sarah. That picture in the lower right, that looked very much like the heat pump that was installed on my house last year. At least that funny green vinyl siding looked like my house. I did have one follow-up question for you, just for clarification. Can you just unpack for a minute the difference between, or the relationship between carbon neutrality and emission reduction targets? I mean, what's the
Absolutely,
relationship
that's a
between
great
those two?
question, Tim. So we have the statutory requirements to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so those are the targets where we need to actually reduce the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that is going into the atmosphere. The carbon neutrality is about the relationship between what's going into the atmosphere and what's being sequestered. So we want to reach a place by 2045 where that is neutral. And that's where the important role of land conservation and our working farms and forests and blue carbon comes in.
Great, thank you. That's
absolutely
helps me. So folks, I can see there's a question coming up. We're gonna be holding these questions, but do get questions into the Q&A for Sarah and the subsequent presenters. Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you. I neglected to say that you were going to be talking about land conservation, maybe thinking that Bureau of Parks and Lands made that obvious. But I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about land conservation and the role it plays in helping us deal with climate change.
Thank you, Tim. Let me just try and maximize my screen here. I'm sorry, the little zoom bar at the top is covering my ability to start the to maximize my presentation. There we go. I can move it out of the way. Here we go. Sorry about that.
I see full screen now.
Great. Thanks for your patience. And I appreciate the invitation. Andy Cutco did most of the hard work putting this presentation together, so all the credit to him. Since we don't have a live audience, I won't have a quiz on this, but many of you may recognize this as Dubuli Public Lands in the heart of Maine's North Woods. And for those of you who haven't been there, I highly recommend scheduling a week into your summer sometime and taking a visit. Absolutely fantastic density of lakes and remote ponds, ecological reserves, and campsites and hiking trails. Really great place. So I'm going to give a run through on some of the Bureau of Parks and Lands resources and also talk about in particular how the Bureau touches down in our resources with climate change and actions that we're taking in those areas, as well as I think many things applicable to the broader conservation community and land trusts as well. So we have 48 state parks and historic sites in the state of Maine, and we also have a public lands division, which is my primary area of responsibility, with 620,000 acres of public lands spread across the state. And you can see some of the the more iconic versions of each of those, Cutler Coast Public Lands on the left, and Quoddy Head State Park on the right. Public lands in particular are managed for recreation, wildlife and biodiversity, our cultural and historic resources, and forest management. Sorry about that. My PowerPoint's behaving a little bit different in Zoom, but seems to be okay. I just want to check, Tim, is my presentation coming across clearly? I have a couple things blocking it on my screen, but seems to be fine. Great. So a little context on all of Maine's conservation lands. I guess this is where we get to the answer to the quiz part from Tim Glidden, and I've got part of the answer up here on the screen for anybody who can do simple math. But today we have 5% of fee-owned unmanaged reserve lands. So those are actually fully owned by land trusts or the state of Maine, national parks, Baxter, all of those. And 5% of that is managed forest, which is also fee-owned for conservation. That tends to be mostly public lands, but also a number of land trusts now are active in forest management. Baxter has a scientific forest management area. And so those are equally sized pieces of the puzzle. And then about 11% of Maine is under conservation easement. Many of those are managed forests, some are forever wild. And as noted, and then the remainder, obviously 79%. So I'm going to go out on a limb when I wasn't able to do the poll, and I was a little nervous. I'm not sure I have the right answer for the first part, but I'm going to go out and guess 6%. Tim, give me the thumbs up or down on that one. Okay. I was going to go low at first, but I dredged my memory and I thought that was it. And so you see Maine's climate goal of 30%. And I was flipping through practicing Andy's presentation while I was cooking dinner a little while ago, and showed it to my 13-year-old son, and he looked at this slide and he said, "Is that realistic?" It's a stretch goal for sure. Another 9% of Maine conserved by 2030, but we need stretch goals, and the current Land for Maine's Future bond is going to go a long ways towards that. I did note, just kind of struck me in seeing some of the 9-figure investments for climate change infrastructure. And somewhere in my office, I have a back of the napkin calculation about how much money it's going to take to conserve 9% of Maine. And I don't remember what the number is, so I won't go out on a limb, but it's 9 figures, well into 9 figures. So the 40 million is sort of a down payment, but we'll need to accelerate that to reach our goal by 2030. So a little bit about how carbon cycles on the landscape. Probably many of you have seen these types of graphics before, but on the left, we have our urban or even suburban landscapes. And those are easily net emitters of greenhouse gases. And hopefully you can read some of the slides and statistics. And then you have sort of the agrarian rural landscape, agriculture, soils that tend to be slightly positive on greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of variability, surely, depending on the type of agriculture and where products are going and that sort of thing. And then you have the area that is the focus of the conservation community, land trusts, although agriculture is obviously as well. Forests take up 2.7, what are we talking about, million metric tons of carbon per year. And just to get a little bit of context on what that is, Maine's land currently stores more than 2 billion tons of carbon, which is 75% in the soil. So we see the trees all the time, and we think of their growth and that being where the carbon is. But it has taken decades and centuries to build up much of that reserve in the soils, which is why it's so important to protect forests. Of the 5.1 total million metric tons of carbon emitted annually in the state of Maine from these sources, fully 2.8 million metric tons of that, or 55%, is offset by uptake in forest growth in Maine. So it's playing a huge role already, and protecting and making sure that it stays as forest is vitally important. So some of the activities that the Bureau of Parks and Lands focused climate change considerations, 3 different categories here. One is acquisition planning for resilience. So there's a lot of acquisition activity going on by various conservation partners, including the state of Maine. And I'll say a little bit more about that on a subsequent slide. Another area is carbon storage and sequestration in our ecological reserves, as well as the managed forest under the Bureau of Parks and Lands. And a key consideration for our state parks, many of which are coastal, is sea level rise. So it's an area of concern for the Bureau. So on our acquisition planning, we are more and more integrating climate change considerations into prioritization. The Maine Natural Areas and the Nature Conservancy have developed a very helpful tool to help us assess the resilience of the landscape, and we're now applying this filter to all of the acquisitions that we work on. On the sequestration front, we have, as many are probably familiar with, ecological reserves as well as managed forest lands. And on the left, there's a slide depicting some of the monitoring of these set aside forest ecological reserve areas and the number of plots that have been collected. And the University of Maine recently finished a study that I'll show on the next slide, summarizing some of the results there. And then managed forest plays a very important role in carbon sequestration as well, by producing long-lived products like furniture and wood that goes into homes and other sorts of things. But drilling into the ecological reserves just a little bit, they store an awful lot of carbon. 30% more above ground carbon in Maine's ecological reserves than on the average acre of forest in Maine. So they're typically much more dense and larger trees. So the other interesting point there is that 35,000 metric tons of carbon are sequestered newly in each year on just BPL's ecological reserves alone, which are about 96,000 acres. And that's equivalent to the yearly emissions from about 7,500 cars. So a big role in storage and a big role in uptake. I just wanted to make mention as I finish up here on the many partnerships that the Bureau of Park relies on. Some of them are statewide actors like the Nature Conservancy, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Conservation Fund, Trust for Public Lands, Appalachian Mountain Club, New England Forestry Foundation, Forest Society of Maine, and others, as well as local land trusts. We have a number of examples of close partnerships with Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust at Dodge Point and Damerscotta, and in other areas throughout the state. I think Tim was mentioning when some of you were logging on that encouraging us to think about some of the things that get us up in the morning and excite us to go to work. And this slide is one of them. I don't get involved much with state parks. I'm focused on our public lands. But this is a slide illustrating the increase in visitation at our state parks over the last 16 or 17 years. Where we had fully 3.3 million visitors in the last year at it. And we're seeing the same trends on public lands. It's going to be really interesting to see how the spike in use of recreational areas, trails, campsites, remote areas that we've seen in the last 2 years continues into the future. I think it's that upward trend is going to continue, and it's great to see people out using and enjoying the land. So I'll leave it there. I hope I haven't gone too far over. I didn't take the opportunity to practice this other than while I was cooking my dinner. So I'll leave it there and look forward to questions and discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. And yes, you definitely did get the numbers right on the poll question. I guess the only observation I'd make before we turn to Ben is that as a sort of a source of some hope for me is, as somebody who has spent most of his career working here in Maine, that jump from about 5 or 6% conserved land to more than 21% in that period, relatively short period of time, gives me a great deal of hope and, frankly, optimism that we can do that again. And I think the way we will do it probably will be quite different than how we did it in the past. And it might involve some different kinds of partners than we've had in the past. But I think there's a source of hope there. And you're right, those numbers of people getting out onto the land, that people have been reconnecting with the natural world at a rate that is unprecedented in the past couple of years. Does pose a few management problems for, I'm sure, for the folks who are building the trails, but people really understand what they have out there, and they're seeing the changes in the world that are going on and want to do something about it. So thank you for that. So Ben, why don't we shift to you and talk a little bit about cars and transportation, not just cars, but transportation.
Sure thing. Thank you, Tim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can everyone see the screen?
I can see
Looks
it.
good. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Tim, and thank you to everyone for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate, and to my fellow presenters. So my name is Ben Lake. I work for an organization called VEIC, which I'll talk about in a little bit. As Tim mentioned, I'm an expert on transportation and decarbonization, and actually a member of the Maine Climate Council's Transportation Working Group since its inception a couple of years ago. So today I'm just going to talk about the work that the Transportation Working Group has done and how that's entered into the climate action plan for the state, and then some actions that folks, all of us, can be working on to help move the needle in the transportation sector to reduce emissions. So, whoops, with that, I'll advance. So just real quickly, to give you a little bit of context, my organization, VEIC, as Tim mentioned, based in Burlington, we do work around the country. Really, our mission is to generate the energy solutions that the world needs. And we do a lot of different things as an organization. We run a number of energy efficiency utilities around the country, in Vermont, in Washington, DC, in Ohio, that focus on reducing energy consumption across the board, sort of analogous to Efficiency Maine, but in other states. But we also do consulting and engineering, and have a team that's focused exclusively on transportation. And so most of our work ultimately comes down to decarbonizing and reducing emissions. And we work a lot within our team on transportation electrification projects, particularly with fleets of different sizes, a lot of transit, a lot of electric school buses, and medium and heavy duty in particular is my area of expertise. So it gives you a little bit of context for what I'll be talking about today and where I'm coming from. And I'll also just say generally, because of that, I'm happy when we do get to questions to do a deeper dive on either electric vehicles, or I also worked for 10 years at the Greater Portland Council of Governments doing sustainability and energy and transportation and transit planning for them. So happy to chat more about that as well. I want to first talk about what is in the Maine Weight plan, climate action plan, and particularly the transportation section. So I've pulled all of this content specifically from the plan, so it should look somewhat similar to what you saw from Sarah, a little bit more in depth on transportation. But as Sarah noted, really the goal of the Transportation Working Group and the transportation section of Maine Weight is to embrace the future of transportation in Maine. And so, as Sarah noted, transportation in our state is responsible for the lion's share of the emissions coming from our state. And so these are primarily emissions from our vehicles, Much of that is light duty transportation, the cars and trucks that most of us drive around the state and that folks travel in and out of the state using. There's also a large portion that comes from medium and heavy duty vehicles that are traveling around the state for various purposes. Of course, there's also shipping and air travel as well in there, but really the majority of it is what occurs on our roads. And so really, I think the group had a pretty forward-looking vision to hit the targets that Sarah had mentioned that are enshrined into law. We really need to be pursuing sort of an aggressive all of the above transition to move forward on reducing these emissions significantly, because so much of hitting our overall climate goals kind of rests with the transportation sector. So the way to move forward, the strategies that were identified and advanced in the plan are threefold, and I'll talk about each one on a separate slide. So the first one is to accelerate Maine's transition to electric vehicles. And like I said, this is really straight out of the executive summary of the plan. So, our slides are going to be a resource, but you can also go directly to the source. And I'm including links in my presentation to get there. So first, to transition to electric vehicles, the state has some really aggressive goals for putting 41,000 light-duty EVs on the road in Maine by 2025 and 219,000 by 2030. So over the next 10 years, seeing a significant portion of our fleet transition over to EVs. By 2022, which is, we're in 2022 now, developing a statewide EV roadmap to identify all the different changes that are necessary to meet these transportation emissions reduction goals. I'm happy to note that plan was developed and finalized just last month over the last year and is available also on the website. And we can chat more about that later if there's interest. And then also focusing on the medium and heavy duty sector, public transportation, school buses, and ferries. As I mentioned, those also make up a significant portion of our on-road emissions. And so figuring out all the different ways that we could potentially go about reducing emissions from that portion of our on-road fleet. So the second key strategy to reducing emissions in this sector is increasing fuel efficiency and use of alternative fuels. So electrification is important, and it's likely going to have the single largest impact and potentially the quickest when we think about the technology that's available. But because we have such a large, diverse fleet with so many different needs and vehicles, really we do need to look at an all of the above strategy. And so that includes improving the efficiency of the vehicles that we have so they consume less energy and produce less emissions, and also looking at other alternative fuels besides just electricity for some larger and heavier duty vehicles that may not be as well suited either now or in the immediate future to transitioning over to EVs. So supporting increased federal fuel efficiency standards, increasing use and partnership with EPA's SmartWay program, which is a program that works with the trucking and shipping industry to improve their efficiency. Supporting local biofuel and biodiesel production in Maine so that they can be used by various types of vehicles in the state, again, that may not be as well suited to electrification. And then targeting an incentive program to low and moderate income drivers to help them switch over to higher efficiency vehicles in the near term. Again, all with the goal of reducing fossil fuel consumption and emissions. And then the third main strategy is to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled. So basically the amount of driving rather than just the types of fuel and energy that is fueling the driving that we do. So just like with efficiency in buildings, if we can reduce the amount of driving that we need to do, then we can reduce the amount of fuel that we need to consume and the emissions that we produce from that. So the acronym for vehicle miles traveled, VMT, you'll see in this slide a number of times. So focusing on light duty, passenger cars and trucks, trying to reduce the vehicle miles traveled by 10%. by current levels by 2025, and then under by 20% by 2030, reducing heavy-duty vehicle miles traveled by 4% by 2030, deploying broadband and high-speed broadband out to Maine farms or homes by 2025 up to 95%, and then serving 99% of homes by 2030. And again, that's a way to ideally reduce the amount of driving that folks need to do if they can, like all of us tonight, participate in events remotely because they have access to the internet. By 2024, strengthening land use policies and coordination to coordinate development, basically, of the built environment, so our buildings and our roads and so forth, that help support reducing vehicle miles traveled and reduce car dependency. At the same time, increasing public transportation funding to the national median of $5 per capita by 2024. And I was happy to note in Sarah's presentation that we've actually exceeded that already, which is great. And then relaunching the Go Maine program, which is a statewide public commuting and shared ride platform to help folks find opportunities to carpool and to share trips to, again, reduce the amount that they're driving in their own vehicle and reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. So that's an overview of the main strategies. And then I'm just going to shift over to talking a little bit more about what individuals can actually do to make an impact in this large realm. So I'm going to highlight here, and Sarah actually already mentioned this, that the state just launched last month the Maine Won't Wait website that talks about the plan, talks about climate impacts, and has great sections focused on taking action. And so I'm just going to highlight a number of the recommendations within the Green Year Transportation section of that. And this whole website is really a great resource for everyone. So I'd encourage you to check it out once we're wrapped up here. So, in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled, that slide that we just left off on, there's a number of ways to go about doing this. So biking and walking more is a really key component of that. Thinking, depending on where you live and where you live relative to your place of work, to places that you run for errands, to folks in your social circles, all the reasons that we typically tend to get in our car, thinking about ways that we can access some of those things without a vehicle. And for people in more urban or mixed use environments, that makes it easier. That's why one of the recommendations in the plan around vehicle miles reduction is to focus on how planning and where we build our buildings and how things are located next to each other really makes a big difference in terms of how often people need to get into their cars. So there's a lot of resources online to help think about how you can hop on a bike, especially in warmer weather, and hopefully walk to places where you need to get to. Considering public transportation options, this is a big one. For folks who live in areas that have access to public transit, this is something that we can all do and that can really make a big difference in terms of, hopping on a bus to get, across town or to the next town over to wherever you might need to go. Really has a dramatic impact, not only on reducing emissions, but also on traffic and, supporting public transportation really improves equity from a standpoint of just giving everyone equitable transit opportunities or transportation opportunities. Other options, as I mentioned, carpooling and telecommuting are also great. We haven't seen as much carpooling during the pandemic over the last couple of years, but part of that is because many folks have been working remotely, and so telecommuting is a great way to really take advantage of the fact that we have this incredible technology that allows us to access information. And, for those who are able to work remotely, even on a part-time basis, it really can have a major impact on the amount that you drive. And hopefully many of us are seeing the benefits of that currently. In terms of accelerating, our transition to electric vehicles, this is an opportunity for, anyone who drives a car to think hard about your next vehicle purchase and whether that is, a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle that has the ability to run for a certain distance on electricity from the battery, and then, for further trips can switch over to a gasoline-powered engine that operates at a high degree of efficiency, or perhaps a fully electric vehicle that you have to plug in, but can travel a couple hundred miles on a full charge. This is a really good way to move the needle on transportation on emissions, and not only change your own personal carbon footprint, but also help build the market and the familiarity and the interest in the state for others to transition and to get more interest from dealers and manufacturers in bringing their products, their electric vehicle products to Maine, which is something we really need to do as well. In terms of some other options here, I'd say, really there's a great opportunity here in our state to get involved with the state and with your local community as well. We're a big state geographically, but we're a relatively small state in terms of population. And once you start connecting with folks, you'll find that it's, kind of a small pool of people that you can connect with and meet and really have a pretty significant impact, which has always been one reason that I'm so happy to live in this state. So, following the work of the Maine Climate Council and the relevant policies that are coming before the Maine legislature, you can go to the Climate Council's website on the Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, and they've got great updates about current legislation and past legislation that's moved forward. You can also sign up for newsletters to learn more about what's currently coming up in the next legislative session that's relevant to transportation and to other climate topics. And then locally, you can make a difference by encouraging your town or your school to do things like adopt electric buses, both transit and school buses, to install public charging infrastructure, to electrify their municipal fleet, to build more sidewalks and bike lanes where there aren't many or any, to help improve accessibility, to provide or provide if they don't already have it, or expand existing public transit in terms of where those routes go, but also in terms of how frequently they operate to make them more of a viable alternative to car transportation. And then supporting mixed use development in town centers where having workplaces and businesses and services all kind of co-located in a small area can really help with reducing the number of times that we need to hop in our car to run an errand, or even the amount of space that we need to devote to parking our vehicles. So this is just a selection of things that you can all be thinking about doing in your own communities and amongst yourselves to start moving the needle. But I think the fact that you're all here now and learning about these topics is a really great first step. So, I'm happy to address questions and have some more discussion, and I understand we'll be doing that at the end. So I will wrap up there.
Two years in Zoom land, and I still don't remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate that. Just one quick follow-up, and I can see some other ones are coming along there, but when you mentioned the expense basically of, when you're going out to buy a new car or just replacing an old car, perhaps with a used car,
Mm-hmm.
Is there any work being done on sort of innovative financing of electric vehicles that would somehow, reduce the capital, upfront capital, and maybe some way to make that pay out over time? Because it does appear that the operating costs of those vehicles are lower over time. But if you're on, even if you're on, middle income, let alone low income person, laying out $35,000 or $40,000, even for a low end EV, is a pretty big hurdle. Is there anything happening in that space?
Well, there's a few things going on. In terms of light duty passenger vehicles, I think one of the biggest things is that we are starting to see larger volumes of sales and leases of new vehicles for, the people who can't afford to buy new and used, or buy new. And what's happening as a result of that is, especially with leases, a lot of EVs are coming off of 3 to 4 year leases with relatively low miles, but the depreciation their values have dropped. We're actually the last couple of years, or at least the last year, because of supply chain constraints and just the turmoil that the auto market has been in, those prices are going up again. But basically, there's a great opportunity to go after used EVs because they may not be the state of the art anymore, quite on the leading edge, but many of them have relatively low miles, plenty of battery life left, and still are going to be quite serviceable for either a primary or a secondary car, and you can get a really good deal. Maybe the price is dropped by half or even more than that. And so the state at the same time has moved forward with offering incentives on used EVs as well, and I think that's a really critical component because, as you pointed out, so many folks, including myself, don't buy new vehicles typically and are kind of waiting for the used market. And I think our dealers have been good about going out and actually buying up vehicles, EVs that are coming off of lease in other parts of the country and bringing them here because there is increasing demand for those. So that's one thing. I think another thing that really helps is just keeping your vehicles, for as long as it's feasible, because the more you drive your EVs, and especially the more that you're offsetting, existing miles that you put on any gasoline-powered vehicles, the more you ultimately end up saving, and the more those vehicles will pay for themselves. And then I'll just say too that EVs in general, the prices are going to continue to drop as manufacturers make more of them. So, just supply chain scale, efficiency at scale, and the batteries are the biggest, most expensive part of these vehicles, and those prices are dropping as well as more manufacturers get into it. So I think we're going to continue to see the downtrend. It's probably going to be a while before all EVs are matching up with gasoline or diesel vehicles, on sticker price alone. But when you factor in the tremendous savings that come from operating them, it ultimately is a pretty good investment.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Ambassador Dana, I have been eager to get to you all through here, and I would love to hear your thoughts on both what the work of the Climate Council was and the Equity Subcommittee, and also your sort of reflections on sort of all the aspects of what's going on with climate change and how that affects folks who may not have the opportunities to jump in and buy a Tesla, let alone do something else.
Great, thank you so much. So I might take those in reverse order and start with kind of, my thoughts on environmental justice and climate justice. And for me, I came into this work as an Indigenous person, obviously with my perspective as a Penobscot person, and climate change and the climate crisis and working on these goals is woven into everything we do, and it always has been. So for us, we've kind of always had these things front of mind and haven't always been at the table, haven't always been asked for our knowledge or stewardship practices. And I think that what happens when you marginalize a community and maybe you rely on stereotypes or kind of tropes and don't know the real humans, Indigenous knowledge is seen as something, in the past. We're seen as like a mythical, died out people, that lived in teepees a long time ago. And any of, the new science and new findings is totally separate from that ancestral knowledge. And we're starting to see that the two can very much coexist and intersect, and that a lot of that Indigenous wisdom is very powerful in the climate work we're doing today. And I have to tell just a little funny story. I watched the movie Don't Look Up on Netflix, and I won't ruin anything, but it's about an asteroid that's going to come hit Earth, and it's a big metaphor for climate change. And the people who discover this asteroid and bring it to everybody's attention are privileged professors, PhD students. And I remember thinking this would be a different movie if the people with this knowledge to save the Earth were of, people of color or Indigenous people or some of these marginalized impacted communities we don't always hear from. Would they get a meeting with the president in very short order. Would anybody, listen to them? And in the movie, they don't really listen to these people either, but at least they're heard in a very national way. So, for me, thinking about environmental justice and climate justice, there is an effort very specifically in Maine too. There is legislation passed, LD 1682, that seeks to define these concepts, for state agencies and in state processes. So that's an ongoing conversation that's happening with a lot of people in Maine. So it's evolving, and I think that nationally it is too. But I think the main themes are, unfortunately, very couched in injustice. How do we mitigate these generations of wrong and harm that have been done to these frontline communities? We need everybody, no matter who you are, no matter where you were born, to have access to clean drinking water, clean air, clean food, clean, land if you want to grow your own food. And that is attainable, I think, for some certain segments of the population, and very much not a reality for others. And some of those other impacted communities may not even understand the barriers in place, or that they've been living in a disadvantaged way because they're just trying to survive and live and work. They may not know the health, in their communities is deteriorating because of climate change. It just feels like oppression and struggle constantly. So, for me as a Penobscot person, I grew up on the Penobscot River at Indian Island. Now, when I was growing up, not that long ago, I'm 37, so a little while ago, I wasn't allowed to swim in the Penobscot River. It was, discolored, it had an odor. It wasn't uncommon to see dead fish floating around. Some mornings, if the paper mills were producing quite a bit, you would see huge chunks of foam floating down the river. And so the Penobscot River is very tied into the health and well-being of our community, of our people, of our ties to our ancestors. So to have this level of pollution really disrupts not just, our ability to eat the fish or to swim or to be there, but it disrupts our connection to our ancestors, our connection to the Mother Earth. And that is internalized and becomes this sort of stress, added to the existence of being a marginalized people dealing with intergenerational trauma and the effects of colonization. So these things are very much, interwoven for my people. And thankfully, the river has cleaned up quite a bit. We've taken a turn from that paper mill industry. But something, and I'll get to the report more broadly in a moment, but something I really liked about our equity report was we wanted to look at data of frontline communities that are next to these industries. So right now I live between the Juniper Ridge landfill and the Nine Dragons paper mill. So on any given morning, we're smelling either one, we're dealing with discharge into the river from either one. And, my whole life growing up, I knew a lot of people that died from cancer. And I thought that was a normal thing, people in their 30s on up to my great grandmother. And, having gone to school in Bangor, going to high school and then having, worked in different places in Maine, it was like, oh, not every community has these many cancer deaths and these other diseases going on. So I'm really glad that one of our recommendations was looking at the health impacts and the public health impacts of having these industries next to frontline communities. So I started with kind of the sadder stuff, and I'd like to end on that more hopeful note and get into the equity report. So I came into being a Maine Climate Council member with, the perspective I've just shared with you. And then there's this other layer of the tribes don't get along well with the state in a lot of areas. So it was complicated. It's always complicated. And we're walking those lines of where do we want to collaborate? Where are we taking a stand for sovereignty? What do we want out of this relationship? We're kind of always doing that dance. but I've really enjoyed my experience on the Climate Council. It is some pressure being the only tribal member, and I know there's other tribal organizations involved in the working groups, but I truly feel that my experience and journey and voice have been given a lot of respect, and I truly appreciate that deeply. And so when the opportunity came to talk about equity, you know, I have read the very great equity report that the University of Maine did for the Climate Council, looking at the Maine won't wait recommendations. And, you know, Director Pingree, you know, offered to help, you know, me co-chair this committee, and GOPIF has been amazing at supporting us, and we have a great facilitator named Carol Martin. So we gathered this collective of people from very diverse backgrounds, and what we did was we went right into Maine Won't Wait. We covered, you know, the 8 areas that Sarah talked about. We would, you know, take those each meeting, and we would run through this criteria of who are the people most effective. Are we taking public health into consideration? Are we thinking about cultural values? You know, how does this fit into our equity charge, which we would lead every meeting with? And one action you all can do is go read our full draft report. You can find it on the Climate Council thing. It's about 66 pages. I don't have it memorized, but there's a whole lot of great information there. And something else that I really like what we did, we didn't just stop at defining equity or you know, environmental justice. We really wanted to flesh out the corners of that. So early on in the report, you'll see that we talk about what is a vulnerable community? What do we mean when we say community resilience, you know, and the types of equity, you know, so you can say, you know, equity means everybody gets equal parts of something, but we wanted to talk about why was it so, you know, not equal before, you know, what is the history to this? So it's not just a distribution issue, it's a historical issue and a contextual issue. So reflecting on all of this has been, you know, that there's a whole lot to think about, and I'm really proud of the draft report. And over the next year, we'll be working with the working groups, you know, getting to some really specific measurable metrics, and how do we, you know, put these into motion, and at the end of, you know, a couple more years, how are we going to measure if we made things more equitable as we're working to these climate goals? And made a bunch of notes for myself. I think, you know, we did listening sessions with the public, and I really think that the report that we resulted with is very much indicative of the conversations that we had. And, you know, an example, we talk about electric vehicles, and you said, you know, what if you can't go and buy a Tesla? You know, we have unhoused people in Maine, you know, what is their reality? You know, do they have access to those walking trails, or, you know, or public transportation? So one thing that I like that we did too was that there's a lot of resources out there already across the agencies in Maine, and there's some exciting new ones, some of them we've talked about tonight. So a lot of the, you know, trick of all of this is going to make sure people eligible for those services know where they are, know what they are, and that the people working in Maine government aren't so siloed, and that they are working, you know, climate informed and equity informed, and that it can be this collaborative, you know, this agency has this program or this rebate, so let's make sure we're getting it to the people. So that was another, you know, charge that we kind of have as the equity subcommittee. So yeah, I guess to wrap up, I think that so much of environmental justice for our people is healing, and you can't really do that unless you're doing some real truth seeking and truth telling, and that's not something to be afraid of. You know, we should be having these conversations out in the open, and I talked about that stress that we internalize, you know, knowing that there's disruption around us out of our control, and it's things like this, and having these discussions and having all voices at the table that makes me feel hopeful and lessens that anxiety for me and my people.
Thank you for a very concise and you know, comprehensive overview of the work, both of the committee, but also of some of the context that that work has to happen in. It really is an enormous challenge to be, I mean, you know, the old joke about trying to fly a plane while you're building it at the same time definitely comes into play here, because, you know, we are dealing with, you know, a whole raft of technical issues that we're talking about here. But at the same time, there's just some really important social structural questions. And as you point out, history that until we, not people, but we really understand it, it's hard to be coming up with some of the most effective and equitable solutions that we're going to have to be dealing with in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 and beyond, years beyond. So thank you for that. So I am very mindful of the fact that it's just gone past 8 o'clock. And Caroline, I don't know if you have been scanning through the questions and see some themes that you'd like to throw out to the panel or to some panelists. I'm looking at it as well. But if there are some questions in there, I think we got some good ones.
Yeah, we have some good ones. Someone wants to know, I think this is a question for Sarah, how the comment is that there's a lot of money flowing into dealing with climate change, and wondering how that flow will move through the annual budgeting process in future years.
Thanks, Caroline. That's a great question. So yeah, I mean, I really did want to highlight the historic nature of some of the federal funding opportunities we have. The American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure money, there's still Build Back Better under consideration. So it's really a remarkable time to be taking climate action in Maine, when we have the strategies and we release the plan, and now we have some real resources to start to implement with. So some of those funds will flow. The governor put forward called the Maine Jobs and Recovery Plan, which was her plan for how to spend the ARPA funds, and the legislature passed the plan. And so some of that is in law about how those federal funds will be spent. Some of the infrastructure dollars and some things will flow directly into existing programs. So, the state might already have a program, for example, for weatherizing homes. And so it's a question of, we already have the program in place, we have the staffing, and the money can flow through the existing program. Sometimes we need a new program, and that's a little bit harder to stand up. So the partnership that I spoke about is a good example. That was in the biennial budget. It's a $4.75 million allocation. The legislature put the money in the budget, and we're just now standing up the program and launched that on December 1st. So some things can flow through existing channels, and then other things need a new vehicle for standing up. But it's really exciting, and as those dollars, there was a lot on those slides, and I think there's a real opportunity to make some real progress on the strategies in the climate action plan with that kind of support.
Great, thank you. I saw in the chat, or not the chat, the question and answer things, there are a couple of questions about, as we move basically on the electric generation, renewable generation side of things. So as we attempt to electrify things like transportation sector, it's kind of basically, where's the juice going to come from? And can you talk a little, maybe that's Sarah, but I would invite others to jump in, because you may have some thoughts as well. But Sarah, maybe that's for you too.
Yeah, I can start, and then Ben may want to jump in as well. I would say, so we have in statute, as I mentioned, a requirement for how much of our energy uses comes from renewable energy. And so it's a great question, and it's absolutely right. We want, as we electrify our cars and our buildings, we want that electricity to be coming from cleaner and cleaner resources. And so that's what Maine's, it's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the RPS, and that's what that requires. And right now we're at 45% in 2021 as required, and we're on track to hit that 80% by 2030. So it's good news. We're making good progress in terms of how much of our energy usage comes from renewable energies. But it's a great question. It's really important.
Ben, did you have anything to add into that?
Sure. I'll just note, in addition to where the electricity is coming from, there's also, the amount. We will likely need more, and infrastructure. The grid, basically, there will need to be some upgrades and changes to be able to accommodate all that power. Our grid nationally is designed to really have power flow in one direction from big power plants that are producing a lot of it to out to businesses and homes and industry and so forth. And so having it generated on site is a new thing, and also having vehicles that can draw down significant amounts of power is another new thing. And then in some cases, as we move forward, those vehicles are going to be able to start putting power back on the grid when we need it, which is exciting. But we need to make sure we're making smart upgrades to accommodate that. One big component of that, I think, is also that we need to be mindful of how we use that electricity to charge electric vehicles, and also, to electrify our homes as well, and transition over to electric heat. And so one thing that we do a lot of work with is what we talk about is like flexible load management or managed charging, where you're using settings on either the car or on the charging station to shift when the vehicle is charging to times when there's excess power available on the grid. And that could be either excess power from idling power plants, or it could be excess power renewable generation that needs somewhere to go. And so a good place to put it is electric vehicle batteries that, if you plug your car in at 5 or 6 o'clock at night and don't need to use it again until 7 o'clock the next morning, that's a very large window of time to charge when you may only need an hour or so steady charging. So the ability to shift to when electricity is cheaper and more available and greener can make a really big difference in terms of how much power and how much upgrade we need to do to our grid.
You may have alluded to this partway through that answer, Ben, thank you. But there were a couple of questions around school buses as well, which I know in other states with much denser, settlement patterns, school buses are sort of being seen both as, seen as potentially storage capacity, as well as, just greening the bus fleet itself. What's the story around school buses in Maine with electrification?
Sure. Well, Maine has its first electric school bus running currently. It's on Mount Desert Island, and we're actually working with Mount Desert High School and the Climate to Thrive in the Nature Conservancy to help support that deployment and study how it's going, so that we can share with a variety of folks around the state, including a lot of other school bus fleets, how electric buses work in the state, and any lessons learned from that deployment. I'd say generally, yes. One of the big appealing aspects of electric school buses is that they have these very large batteries and very predictable schedules, and typically time in the middle of the day where they don't need to be operating. And so they're very good candidates for what I referenced earlier, the vehicle to grid ability of being able to take power and store it and then put it back on to the grid at times of need when it might be most needed. And in a lot of cases, under our typical use, that's during the day, and in particularly late afternoon or mid-afternoon is when we typically get peaks in demand. So conveniently, because there's need for electricity at those times, there's a value associated with being able to put money or put electricity back onto the grid at peak times. And so that's, Tim, to get to your earlier question about innovative financing. Utilities in other parts of the country are designing programs that allow them to compensate electric school bus fleets for providing power back onto the grid when it's most needed. And so that can help to offset the extra cost of those buses. I will say generally the technology is there that we could be deploying a lot of these buses around the state. They typically are most cost effective when you can, minimize the size of the battery and really maximize the amount of miles you put on them on an annual basis. And so what that typically means is most fleets look to their shorter routes first to start electrifying, and then can kind of expand from there. But the technology is there. Really, the biggest hurdle is figuring out the financing mechanisms to make it work financially for fleets. And I think we're, again, referencing the funds that are coming our way. There's a big pot of money for the US EPA to support electric school bus deployments around the country, and we're anxious to see that help get a lot more school buses out in Maine and around the country. That I think will again help drive those costs down further.
Great, thank you. You know, there's a series of questions that all sort of come into various angles of education. You know, from what I probably in an outdated term might think of as vocational education, because there's a whole series of new jobs coming along here, but also just education for younger folks who may be forming their sets of expectations about, you know, how do they consume energy? How do they move around? You know, how does all that work? Did the Climate Council have a portion of its work that really was thinking about what are the implications for curriculum in various ways?
So I'll start on that one, and then if others want to chime in, Tim. That's a great question. I think there's a couple different ways that the Climate Action Plan addressed that. One is just thinking about education generally, and how the state engages youth and community members and lots of different people in terms of understanding climate and understanding the climate strategies, and what we can do to make a difference here. So there's that kind of education piece that is a part of the Climate Action Plan. There's also a real focus on the clean energy economy and the opportunity there for jobs. And so thinking about electricians to install solar and HVAC technicians to install heat pumps, and kind of what those new workforce opportunities can be for the state, and how we help people find their way into those new careers. Clean energy is the fastest growing sector in the country. And the governor's energy office did do a report on growing that sector, including both supporting innovation, but also thinking about the workforce that's necessary. And so I think that's a really important component as well. And it's an area of focus for the governor's energy office in terms of thinking about how we build a pipeline to support the new opportunities and this clean energy economy.
Thanks. Anybody else have a sort of a thought on that educational side of things? If not, I will just move along. You know, a question in the Q&A sort of triggered a thought of mine as well around what we used to think about a lot was, you know, energy conservation was the first place to go to. So obviously, you know, more efficient cars and things like that. I'm actually not, we didn't talk about that much tonight, but is energy conservation, I'm thinking particularly about things like other sectors where, you know, energy conservation in homes or something like that might be really important. And just to sort of bridge a little bit back to the justice issue, there's lots of, I mean, I know from, it's probably somewhat outdated information, but Maine has very old housing stock, I believe. And a lot of folks, you know, they don't own the home that they are living. So, you know, their ability to think about how do you invest to save energy and maybe save a little money is constrained in that way. So there's a real sort of hairball of issues all tied up in that, that cuts across equity and energy issues. What's the council thinking in those areas? And anybody here could jump in on this one.
I would just say it was a big area of focus for the buildings working group, and that's a lot of the recommendations is around energy efficiency and weatherization. But I would definitely defer to Ambassador Dana on this one. I know the equity subcommittee spent a lot of time talking about these exact issues.
Yeah, we dedicated a whole lot of time to the buildings issue and the weatherization, and you know, just a real life thing that just happened was the fire in the Bronx. You know, started with a space heater in that large building. So when you have when you don't have adequate heating in the building, so you're looking to these other things, you know, they might not be working properly, or they, like, you know, electricity isn't wired great. And then you have these horrible events that don't just affect the one person, but when you have this congregate housing, it gets real tragic real fast. So we talked a lot about, as you mentioned, the old houses. We talked a lot about, coastal communities, they're having a lot of otherization issues. And, I would definitely point you to all of the recommendations, but that's definitely a huge deal for us. And, even thinking about access to air conditioning, people in these heat waves, people without access to that are having poorer health outcomes, so they're saving energy by not having that air conditioning, but they are ending up in the hospital with heat stroke and kind of taxing our resources in other ways. So that it's complicated and it's layered, and heat pumps are such a great tool, and so we're looking at ways to make those more affordable and easier for folks to get. We talked about incentives for landlords, when we have these congregate housing settings, especially in Southern Maine, probably, can they put in electric vehicle charging ports? Can they work on their, are there incentives and rebates for them to update their buildings? And then you're helping a lot of people in one fell swoop. So that's definitely an issue that we talked about quite a bit, and it's in our report.
Is there, and this is kind of a broad question, but I might just sort of start with you, Maulian, on this one is, when you think about that kind of question, and folks listening in the audience this evening, if they were thinking about something that they might be able to do or pay attention to in their own community, whether it be show up at Board of Selectmen or the town council to talk about fill in the blank here, where would you point people to start that kind of conversation? And let's just start it with the climate justice questions. I mean, the kind of things you were just talking about, but I think obviously this branches out to all the aspects here.
Yeah, I think getting to know everyone in your community and beyond, and we're not going to make any progress on this unless we're bringing everyone along with us. And I think if this group had formed 15, 20 years ago, there may not have been a tribal member included in these discussions, let alone a whole committee of underserved people. So I think knowledge is power, and getting to know your neighbors, and it's hard to say, one specific action you can take, but I think just being very aware of all of the challenges in your community. Certainly the pandemic has taught us a lot about humanity and this global network we are all in. So, it matters that my kids are going to school with other people's kids and families. I should know a little bit about them, to see if my kids will catch this disease from them and bring it home, so we're all having to think about the world beyond ourselves. And I know that's not very specific, but I think that might be the best philosophy to get a lot of climate work done, is thinking, about that connectedness of us all.
I really like that message of turning back to the community ties that pull us together, as opposed to a lot of what we see in civil discourse or uncivil discourse these days, as a way of knowing who our neighbors really are and what their needs are and how they relate to us. So I think that is at the heart of solving a lot of these problems if you're starting from the bottom up. That's a fairly cosmic statement, but other folks just thinking about what people could be just taking action on right in their hometowns, or showing up to the legislature. If Sarah, if there's a particular piece of legislation, or Maulian, if there's particular legislation showing up this session that people could talk to their local representatives about, what can people do to actually take some action here? Anybody jump in.
I would echo what Ambassador Dana said. I think a lot of this starts with community conversations and figuring out what are the climate impacts that your community is going to be experiencing, and who in your community is most vulnerable to those impacts, and what steps do you need to take to help make the whole community more resilient. So I think looking at your own community vulnerability and your community priorities. So a lot of communities have invested in solar on their fire barn or thinking about heat pumps for their municipal building. So those kind of very concrete actions can have a real impact in terms of reducing emissions, transitioning to clean energy. So I would put in another plug for the new partnership program, which if communities, when you enroll as a community, you become eligible for these action grants. And we also have grants to service providers to help communities with those community conversations and thinking about what their priorities are. But I think Ambassador Dana is exactly right, like sort of looking around at your neighbors and your colleagues and seeing sort of what makes the most sense for you, because that's what's been really exciting to see, is the sort of action at the local level that is galvanized.
Super. Bill, any thoughts you have from the land conservation side? I mean, for again, this question of what can people be doing, you know, in their own hometown or just within reach of their own agency. What can they be doing around the land conservation world of action?
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind. The one we've been very focused on energy, so the one that comes to mind is just sharing what I'm observing. So the Bureau of Parks and Lands is entirely self-funded in terms of we don't receive any general fund money. All the resources to manage the recreation, public access, research, wildlife management on public lands comes largely from the sustainable harvest of timber on those lands, which goes to support the local economy. And electrification is obviously such a huge part of the equation. But I would just add what I'm observing, trying to manage a bureau that is operating in the current situation we have in Maine's economy, where pulp and paper is declining greatly, and we've lost markets for our low value products, which I'm optimistic in that, you know, as much as it's sustained Maine's economy for a long time, pulp and paper has, and will be around for a while ahead. There's all of a sudden a lot of fiber available for other things that have a much more positive carbon input. So about 10 feet below me in my dining room here, there's a 3-ton pellet hopper that feeds an automated furnace that replaced an oil burner about 10 years ago. And the pellet truck drives up to the curb and blows in pellets, and it runs off my thermostat, and nobody ever moves a bag, and big piles of plastic aren't around. So that's one example, but I encourage people to think about the role of the future forest economy. There's some exciting things coming, such as the development of biofuels that will save people the big expense I had of putting in a pellet furnace by being able to burn forest originated biofuels basically in their existing oil furnace. So keep an eye out for forest economy based innovations as well. And it can be a very complex equation, whether the different uses are positive or negative, but I just put a plug in for that. That's what's on my mind.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. I am seeing, at least by my clock, it's 8:31. And so I am very respectful of people's time, especially when they're volunteering, getting paid vast sums of money to participate in these presentations. And I want to let you get back to your families. I would say to the folks who are watching and hopefully going to dial in again, we have several more, I think 4 more sessions coming along. And we're thinking about doing a little bit of assigning, a little bit of homework each week. Not that we're going to give a quiz, but you just might be thinking about what you've learned. And I guess a couple of things come to mind for me, which is think over the next week about what you might do to reduce a few vehicle miles traveled in your own daily lives, whether or not just be consolidating a few trips to the store. You're probably not getting on your bikes too frequently unless you are very hardy right now. You might also go out and see if you could learn how much land is conserved in your own community. You know, what's going on? What's your local land trust doing? How much land is conserved? What's happening on that land right now? I'd also encourage you to see if you could learn a bit more about the vulnerable communities in your own hometown. Who are the folks who perhaps are not able to take advantage of some of the things that we've been talking about as options here today? Just get to know your neighbors a little bit. What's going on in your own hometown? And I guess beyond that, I just would encourage you all to sign up for next week's session. Caroline, I'm going to apologize and say I don't have it memorized what it is, but perhaps you can, as we wrap up, you'll be able to do that. Before you do that, I really want to thank Bill, Sarah, Maulian, Ben. Thank you very much for sharing an hour and a half of your evening with us and the time you spent prepping for this. I appreciate all the work that you do. It's my reason for hope is because people like you are putting your shoulders to the wheel and making change. And thank you to the still 56 people who are on the call, who are toughing it out right to the bitter end. Thank you as well. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Caroline, what is going to be on for next week?
Next week the title is What's on Your Dinner Plate? We'll be looking at sort of food systems, what food waste contributes to climate change, and what role agricultural soils can play as a carbon reservoir. And I just want to make a note that based on some of the questions, we'll be addressing some of them in session 4, where we'll have Efficiency Maine, which will give a lot of information about how to, weatherization and some of the programs they have to support that. So thanks to everybody. And I will try to get a copy of all of our presenters' PowerPoints and send those out if people want a closer look at those.
Thank you all, and do look at the Maine Won't Wait Climate Council plan. There's a lot of really good material on there, and as several of you presenters have said, there are a lot of resources there if you would like to learn more, action or otherwise. Thanks all. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.